Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this morning and welcome to the CTS Planning and Economy Winter Seminar. I'm Hannah Grun. I am a program coordinator with the Center for Transportation Studies. Seminars are open to anyone interested in learning more about transportation research at the University of Minnesota. Undergraduate and graduate students, faculty, and practitioners are encouraged to attend. Today's seminar is being streamed on the web, so we have a remote audience as well as a live one. For that reason, I will ask that our live audience hold questions until the end, and please use the microphone to ask your questions so the folks online can hear. Today we will be hearing from Professor Diwakar Gupta about statistical analysis of fare compliance, and to introduce that presentation, Richard Moore of Metro Transit will give a brief talk. So here's Richard Moore.
Great, thank you. So, it is working? Okay, great. So my name's Rich Moore, and I work for Metro Transit, and I'm the supervisor of revenue and ridership out there. And my department's primary jobs are to make sure the money gets to the bank, and then to calculate ridership on Blue Line, Green Line, Northstar, and the bus system. So those are our primary jobs and what we work on. And so we had Professor Gupta and Yibin work on a project for us, and it was regarding the fare compliance and statistical analysis on that. And it worked out very, very well for us. But so first I thought maybe would share some reasons why we needed that done. And the first reason was we needed an objective answer as to what exactly our fare compliance rate was or is. And it's really important for us because there was actually controversy or disagreement within the organization exactly to what it was. What would happen is, like, the police go out and they do their checking and they keep records, and so they would say the compliance is 98, 99%. Audit went out in 2008 and they did a study, and they come back and they say the compliance is somewhere between 89% and 92%. So it was quite a bit of variation there. And then the finance department would say, well, it's actually, we think it's somewhere between there and probably closer to the police statistics. But so we needed an objective source there to kind of come in and help us with that. It's important for us to know how much revenue we're losing. Okay. Perfect. It's important for us to know how much revenue we're losing. We want to know if our enforcement policies are relatively good or bad, relatively successful or unsuccessful. And then we wanted to know if we could more effectively deploy some resources to increase enforcement if we really wanted to do that. There's still question about whether our enforcement is adequate or not. And we wanted to create an objective and repeatable process where we could undertake this in the future and compare the results and see how we're doing. And then another big reason to do it was to possibly offer this methodology to other agencies, because there is no standard method throughout the industry. And if you look at industry statistics, you'll see great variation in the compliance rates, and that's probably for a couple reasons. There's probably great variance in the compliance rates, but there's also variation, we're sure, in the methodologies. So those were kind of the reasons why we did that. And, you know, evasion is a tricky thing. It comes up a lot of times because if you're just going out there and riding the rail and you don't know a lot about the process, you'll think that there's a lot of evasion out there. And we'll get calls from the media too about evasion. Because what happens, a lot of people don't have to tag on to the rail system. If you ride the bus, you get a magnetic transfer card. And there's no place to put that in when you get to the rail system. If you have a smart card, if you have a go-to card, if you have a MetroPass, UPass, CPass, any of those, you've already paid for the pass. You should be tagging onto the rail, but we know a lot of people don't. 20, 30% of people don't do it. So again, those people look like fare evaders too, if you're just standing there and you're the common person and you don't think about it a lot. And actually, I just had a question about that a couple weeks ago and walked through that with somebody. And we'll often get questions from the legislature about it and explain to them what's going on. And an important note is evasion is different than compliance. We look at evasion as people actually not paying the fares, and that's really, really important to us. Whereas compliance, we look at are people actually tagging onto the system or not, because we want that data and we want people to tag on. But you're not going to get a $180 ticket if you have a valid fare and you didn't tag on. That's just not going to happen. So evasion is important to us because it affects our revenue. 30% of our budget comes from our fare revenue, and so we need that money. There's high legislative interest in our evasion rate, and there's high media interest. The media is looking for a good story to put out. Legislators just want to make sure that we are doing the right things, that we're being good stewards of the resources that we're given, and that we're collecting what we should from our riders. We have a barrier-free system which relies on the police for enforcement. So how it works is the police will do periodic inspections and they'll check people. You present your fare payment. If you don't have a valid fare, generally they actually keep records and they'll check the individuals. Usually at first they'll give a warning, but they keep records of the warnings. If you've been warned, then they will give you a ticket, and it's a $180 ticket. So the trade-off risk of a $2 fare basically versus a $180 ticket is kind of the risk-reward game you play if you try to evade the fare. And so the results of the project. One great result for me that Professor Gupta and Yibin probably didn't realize was kind of confirmed our ridership calculations. That had not been done for since before I was there, or right when I first started. Audit had done a study, and actually we had some problems in the calculations. Those were changed. They did their calculations, and for the year I think our ridership was within 50,000 rides, so it was very close. So that was very good for me, reassuring for me. They actually identified some sampling bias. We actually did not change that because we've completely changed the methodology, how we calculate rides now. We used to have 2 samplers go out and ride the trains all day, and with their sampling, they would not get enough samples in a month to really do a good calculation of the ridership for the month. So we would actually take 3 months worth of those samples and roll them into each month to calculate ridership. So a little bit dirty, whereas now we use the automatic people counters, and we've got a ton of data from that, and it works very, very well. We get data within a couple days, and we actually see fluctuations in the daily ridership, and it's working very, very well for us. So, but it was important to identify those types of biases had we continued with that method. They identified differences between weekday and weekend compliance rates. They came up with a nice inspection guide for the police that they weren't that enthusiastic about, but you know, we weren't telling them to go and do this. I mean, obviously, if there's a crime, you need to go do that. But it was important, and actually the chief appreciated it because it gave a guide as to, you know, kind of where you can sample and how, not sample, I'm used to sampling, they inspect fares, where you could do your inspections up and down the line to get in front of the most people to help with compliance. The audit report is not done yet. Our internal audit is finishing a audit where they are calculating our compliance on green line and blue line. And they used the study. They took a look at the study and they referenced the study in a few places in what they're going to write up, and that's going to be finalized in the next couple of weeks here. And most importantly, we have a statistically valid method that can be repeated, and it's from an independent source, so we can kind of rely on what's going on. So that's what was most important for us. And so now I'm just going to introduce Professor Gupta, and I got a little sheet here. So Professor Gupta's research focuses on stochastic models for supply chain management, emphasizing coordination of decentralized supply chains. He directs the supply chain operation and research library, carries out cutting-edge research in management and operations. He also carries out research on the design and control of manufacturing systems and revenue management in manufacturing and service industries. So I will turn it over to Professor Gupta. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks. I don't need this, right? Do I need this?
This is so the room hears you a little bit better. You might be loud enough.
That's what I thought.
You're good.
Okay.
She got the bad seat if the screen's right in front of her.
Good morning. Everybody awake yet? The cold would do that to you. So, thank you, Richard, for that nice introduction. For me, the best part of working on this project was working with colleagues like Richard and Dustin and Thomas. Thomas has since left Metro Transit, and he is now, I think Nicholas has taken over his position. Yeah, so we made good friends, and I think to me, that's worth more than this project, so had fun. So let me talk a little bit about what we did, and please feel free to ask questions. Richard already introduced the mission, but let me say specifically what we set out to do. Our mission was to use data, we didn't collect any data, which was already available, to estimate ridership and non-compliance. And we teased out some differences between non-compliance and evasion, as you'll see when we talk about this more. And this was only on the Hiawatha light rail line. We didn't have the green line at that time. So this study is already more than a year old. We were also trying to evaluate and improve as we went along ridership estimation procedures that are currently in use, or that were at that moment in use at Metro Transit. This, if you have not ridden the Hiawatha rail line, it's a line that runs from Target Field Station to the Mall of America. There are 19 stations, and I think it has been a model of success for a long time for Metro Transit in terms of how it has operated. Richard mentioned these are barrier-free stations. Here's an example. This is the Government Plaza station in downtown. What it shows is passengers can walk onto the station without needing to turn any stiles or cross any barriers of any sort. And this gives the impression that, oh well, so there is no checking, hence perhaps the evasion rate might be high. So I think part of the public perception is based on the fact that we have a barrier-free system where proof of purchase is the responsibility of the rider. It's not necessarily checked when you enter the station, but you're supposed to have it. And the way it is checked is by transit police enforcing compliance. And police officers ride the trains, they check the tickets and issue warnings and citations. In terms of checking for the rider count, at that time there were 2 employees who were continuously riding the trains and counting the people who were boarding the trains. So I have a small YouTube video here. I hope that there is internet. right? Can't locate. It's not connected.
Let's try this.
All right. I don't see the lights blinking as yet. Let's see. Nope, that's okay. Let me try one more time. Okay, it is working. Oh, sound is not on. Okay, let us go back
See
and
if the sound's on the computer itself.
okay. Can I start it now? This is what's known as a mobile police validator. It's a cell phone. And she's explaining how she checks, but somehow it's not coming through. Shall I try one more time? It says mute, unmute. You want to unmute it?
Those are silly microphones.
Okay.
We'll just do it this way. See if I can hear it.
Scanned it on at 46th Street Station. That's all we need. It shows that they scanned it, they're good to go. There's another sign that will show up.
Start now.
You hold it up, you put this on here, you click the middle button, and it starts to scan it. And then we get this screen that pops up, which shows us if it's valid or not, and it says their regular full fares, what they scanned it on at 46th Street Station. That's all we need. It shows that they scanned it, they're good to go. There's another sign that will show up, will tell us if they were scanned their card on a bus before they got on the train. Or if they forgot to scan their card, a little stop sign will show up and say time expired, which means I gotta hop off and scan their card.
Just an explanation about time expired. If a person tagged it more than 2.5 hours before, that's considered non-compliant. Sorry.
Going through the whole YouTube cycle of videos.
Okay, okay, that's what's going on. And so how do I shut that off?
Turn it off here so you could just,
I can continue?
yeah.
Okay. All right. The MPV device, every time a police officer tags, it generates the data. And in the data, we can see whether the card was a pass or was it a stored value card. And in fact, we eliminated all passes. So passes are not counted as being non-compliant because even if the passenger did not tag it, they were in possession of a valid fare. So in our calculations, we were very careful. We looked at the differences between passes and between stored value cards. Also, there are some very special cases. Suppose somebody's stored value card runs out of money. Metro Transit still allows them to go home. So they could have a negative balance, or it did allow in those days. Maybe it's no longer. So that you will see sometimes that there will be an invalid transaction because the balance went negative. We were also careful to take care of those, and we treated those as valid tags. So we took a lot of precautions in making sure we were not overestimating non-compliance in any way. So what are the different types of payment methods? There are paper tickets that people buy at the ticket vending machines. There are stored value cards. There are passes. The stored value cards are the ones that, and passes are the ones that you see the policeman can check using their mobile validator device. And there are transfers from buses. So at every station, there are also bus stops, and people can get off the bus and get onto the train and vice versa. Data types. So we got quite a bit of data from Metro Transit. The one that we finally used for this study was 2012 data. We had one full year of data for the manual counts by the revenue management group. We had what is known as cubic data, which is the ticket vending machine and card reader. So when a passenger enters the train station, they're supposed to tag the card reader. That's what the policeman is checking, whether they tagged or not, and when it was tagged last. We have data for special events, when Metro Transit sometimes runs special trains for a game, let's say, in the target field. We had the mobile phone validator data, and we had the police activity logs. Policemen at the end of each day log how many citations and warnings they gave during their shift. We had 1 year of data for the first 3 sources and 3 months of data for the last 2. Actually, we had a whole year for mobile phone validator, but when it came to comparing it with the police activity log, we only used 3 months because we had only 3 months of police activity log. What methods did we use? We used fairly standard statistical estimation methods. We ran various tests of hypotheses, and we did sample size estimations. We made sure that we had confidence interval estimations around those. Some of the details are a bit technical. We had to make some assumptions about the underlying distributions, etc. And you will see, if you want the details, they are in the report, and I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'd like to give you an overview of how we did this. We already knew that we could know when the passenger used the card reader, what station they were at. We know the time of the day. We know the day of the week. So we decided to group data according to these categories, in these groups. By travel direction, whether they're going north or south. By the station, by stratum, which refers to 4 time periods in a day: AM peak, PM peak, and AM off peak and PM off peak. So thus we had these 4 groups of time. Within each group, we calculated ridership and noncompliance. We looked for whether there were differences across groups. And then if there were differences, we adjusted for those differences in estimating the overall compliance rates and ridership rates. So this was done very meticulously, and we took care of, in our minds, any possible objections somebody could have to the way we aggregated information. And we think that we did it as accurately as can be done, given the data that we had. So let me talk a little bit about what are our main findings, and I'd like to then take your questions. So here's what we found, that if we compare cubic and police validator data from which we can get those passengers who did not tag, then the estimates are quite different compared to the TRR data. But that is expected. Remember that in the TRR data, which are manual counts, we also have paper tickets or transfers from buses, which we don't have in the cubic and MPV data, which is largely the tags, which are largely the card reader and the police mobile validator data. What's interesting is that we found a fairly close relationship. So if you focus on the top graph, you will see in the blue the TRR count, and in the red the cubic data counts that we got after adding the MPV information. What you see is that there is a very close correlation between the 2 types of data. And our hypothesis is actually Metro Transit doesn't need to manually count anything. They could just calculate, test the ratios between from historical data, test the ratios between cubic and the total counts that they've had in the past, and use those to scale up from the automated counts. And every couple of years, they can rerun this experiment to check whether their scaling is correct or not. So we suggested that. I don't know what happened. You guys didn't follow that, but that's something that we think can be done, and it would be pretty easy, fully automated. We can come up with the coefficients that you will use for each hour, and what you see on the x-axis is the hour of the day, and we have plotted the counts by the hour of the day versus the two kinds of counts that we have, cubic and TRR. This is for the entire year of 2012. Now, the second chart you see, again, this is quite a dense graph, so I want you to sort of think about what's going on. There are two axes, the two y-axes or vertical axes. On the left, we show the trips that were scheduled per day. On the right, we show the number of samples taken. So you see there's a big difference in the two vertical scales. One goes from 0 to 150, the other goes from 0 to 15. So the idea is we are placing them close together, the two graphs, to show you, this is for the visual effect, how closely they line up. So in effect, what we want is when you sample in proportion of the number of trips you have in any given hour. So if in some hours you have more trips, you sample more. And if you do it proportionally, then you can take your sample average. And that would be an accurate way of calculating the overall average ridership. So Metro Transit at the time was taking average of their samplers' values without realizing that their sampling frequency did not match with the number of trips frequency or number of trains that were going back and forth. And we corrected for that, and that was what Richard was talking about, which after we did all of our calculations actually meant the ridership is slightly more than what Metro Transit thought, which is interesting. So in fact, if this means dollars, maybe that already paid for our study.
It's good we want to be conservative.
But we can stand behind it, and we can defend it. So those were some of the interesting findings. First, that you can estimate ridership without really doing any manual counts in our minds. Occasionally checking that these ratios between overall manual counts and the cubic data remain invariant. We don't see any strong reason why they should change very dramatically from one year to another year. We also think that any sampling strategy has to take into account the frequency with which trains are running back and forth within each hour. Or you don't do simple averaging, then you do some sort of weighted averaging. You need to take into account the frequency of the trains. So here are the numbers.
You don't
Yes.
actually have to change the sampling, you just adjust.
Right.
Just wait to get the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. One or the other.
So yes.
Either you adjust the sampling or you weight it.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I was trying to say. And that's what we did. We adjusted. Of course, we couldn't change the sampling because all we had is retrospective data. So we found that our estimate is about 50,000 or so riders more once you account for that difference. We also found that ridership varies by travel direction, station, stratum, and day of the week. So in fact, these are statistically valid differences. And this means that when we are computing noncompliance or computing evasion, we need to take into account these differences. We can't just aggregate across all of these groups. So what is meant by evasion rate? Let's examine this first before we look at the numbers. Metro Transit thinks that evasion rate means the number of citations and warnings given by the police officers. Whereas non-compliance could occur in situations where the police officer does not issue a warning, does not issue a citation, simply asks the passenger to get off at the next station and tag their card. Suppose they have a smart value card or stored value card which hasn't been tagged, they could just tell the passenger, please get off and tag it at the next station. That's neither warning nor citation, and there could be quite a few of these instances. The other thing that we think happens when you are a cardholder is that you could legitimately miscalculate whether it is exactly 2.5 hours or less, and I think there is some discretion involved in how police officers interpret what that time window means. So that's why the evasion rate, if you look only at police activity logs data, is about 0.55%, less than 1% on weekdays, and 0.7% higher on weekends. But if you look at evasion rate, which we calculated from the data as those cards that the policeman checked where the last tagged time point was more than 2.5 hours before the current time point, we call that non-compliant. After taking out all of the anomalies that I talked about, that is cases where the stored value was negative or cases where it was a pass, and there are also cases where the timestamp on the reader that the policeman is using could be before the timestamp when the card was checked. And so we were told this is because the phones are not set correctly on that particular route. So we ignored all of these types of anomalies. And still the rate, if you look at evasion rate among cardholders, is about 10 times larger. And I have a theory about it, which I will talk about. It's a conjecture. It's not tested in any way as to why this could be higher. And we did include some of that in our report. But evasion rate among cardholders, if you look at non-compliance in this way as equal to evasion, is much higher. And evasion rate varies by stratum, direction, and station. So in fact, we thought this could be a strategy for police to determine where to put their policing effort. What to think about? Where should they deploy the police? The other interesting aspect of this problem is that if I know that on a particular roadway at 9 a.m. there is a cop car checking the traffic speed, and it happens every day, it may have the desired effect, but I will slow down just for that period of time. Well, I never speed, but I never said this. But this can happen. And so the issue is whether, in fact, those that evade, they're aware of when police are more likely to be riding the trains. And so those were some of the reasons we wanted to investigate a deployment strategy for policemen, when they should go out, which trains they should ride, at what time of the day. And we came up with a plan for doing this, but it wasn't adopted. So we stopped doing that in the middle of our project. There was some resistance that, in fact, police wanted to maintain their schedules at that time. And I think there's a lot that can be gained by carefully optimizing schedules of the policemen as to when they go out and what they check. Another thing I should point out, that we also found big differences across policemen in terms of how many cards they check in a particular time period, and amongst those, how many non-compliant they find, or how many citations they give. Some policemen give many more citations than others. And these are differences that I think are worth investigating. So overall, then, we also checked whether, if we needed a certain level of precision, and let me explain what this means. You see there is a column that says tolerance alpha. What this means is, suppose I want my evasion rate estimate to be within this tolerance, and let me explain what that means. Suppose my evasion rate is 10%, and I want it to be within 1%. That means I want it to be, the estimate to be no less than 9.9 and no more than 10.1. That's what we mean. So if we want that level of accuracy in our estimate of non-compliance, then we would need to check pretty much everybody, 7.1 million passengers out of 7.9. If you need that kind of accuracy. If you want 5% accuracy in your non-compliance testing, then you need to check 285,000 passengers or riders. And Metro Transit was in 2012, at the rate they were checking, would have checked 103,598 rides. And if you want 10%, then it is 71,000, which means if they can live with a little more inaccuracy in their estimate of non-compliance, then they can reduce the police effort. Now, there could be some unintended consequences of that. If people find out there are less police, and it may be that the evasion rate might go up. We don't know that. So this is based only on extrapolating what we had in the data at that time. On the weekends, however, we find that, in fact, even to achieve 10%, we have to increase the policing effort. So the last column, which says effort index mu, it tells you what should be the multiplier of effort that you will need to achieve that accuracy. So for weekend estimation of 10% accuracy, we need to have about 1.5 times more effort than they're currently putting in. For weekday, about 70% of the effort that they currently put in, which means they could reduce their weekday effort and increase their weekend effort, and then it would be more balanced in terms of the accuracy of the estimate. So what were some of our recommendations? One of our key recommendations was that the frequency of manual counts could be substantially reduced by using cubic data to estimate ridership. That weekend inspection frequency should be increased if precision equal to weekday evasion rate estimate is desired. Right now, the two precision levels are very different. And so it's not just that weekend rate is more. We are also less certain that we've calculated it correctly. We think that these 10-factor of difference between police activity log data and MPV data is in fact very strange. And we have a bunch of hypotheses, conjectures rather I should say. We didn't check anything, or we had no means of testing it. But one of our conjectures is that police officers don't always record all of the warnings that they give. If they give a citation, there is actually a physical record. There's a paper ticket that we have. And so we know for sure that a citation was given. But warnings, the policemen or women at the end of the day, they will write down how many warnings they gave. And they could have given more or less, we don't know. The second hypothesis we have is that, in fact, it is very easy for someone who has a stored value card to not tag it and explain to the police officer, I forgot to do it, and they just tell them, okay, you get off and tag it at the next station. That may or may not be incorrect in any way, so I'm not passing any value judgment, but that might explain why there is such a big difference between what we think is the non-compliance rate in the MPV data and what we see in the PAL data or police activity log data. We also think that this kind of analysis should be repeated now that we have developed the code to do it. It can be repeated quite painlessly. So long as the data remains in the same format, there is a computer program that can be used to rerun the analysis fairly quickly. Future work where Yibin and I think that most of the gains will come from is actually coming up with an overall optimal inspection strategy and estimation strategy jointly. Not to do these things separately where we have a given inspection strategy and then we try to estimate things as best as we can, because it's not just a matter of estimation, it's also a matter of reducing non-compliance. So how can we achieve both goals of estimating something well and reducing non-compliance at the same time? And we think it's possible. The other possibility is to think about, because we have this wonderful data set, we can look at when they sold a pass, how many times the users actually use it. And how much revenue they might be losing, for example, by selling a pass for heavy users versus sometimes people buy a pass and don't use it very often. So right now there are certain product categories. There are certain types of passes, monthly passes. I think there's a weekly pass also. So the question comes, how do you design your fare products in such a way that you look at the pattern of usage and then try to maximize both the ridership and the revenue that transit systems can get from these sorts of fare products. So product differentiation, basically. And that's all I have.
So if anybody has any questions, and if you're watching online and you have a question, please type it into the chat bubble. Connie?
I had a question about how did you know the direction of travel? Because some of the stations, I mean, I assume if you have a side platform, you assume the direction of travel by where the person tagged. You know, if you're headed south, you tag on the platform headed south. But when you have center platforms, like some of the downtown ones, they have one place to tag and you don't know which direction they're going.
I think we have access to all the train numbers. And that's how we knew at that time, right, Yubin? We looked at all the...
Yeah, the police know what direction they're going, and it's coded in on there, so they know the direction of the trip.
Well, I understand that for the police logs, but I mean, when you're trying to count the number of, like the card readers is what I'm talking about. If I get on at a center platform and tag my card reader, I mean, how do you know what the actual number of riders is going north or south? Because I could have gotten on either one of those trains.
But they're using the data from the police. They're using the data from the police validator. So from the tags of the people, well, they're actually on the train, not from the TVMs at the stations out there is what's going on.
But we also know in terms of number of trains, we know how many trains are going in each direction for every hour. We have the full schedule. So suppose we are using the station data, we can, and we don't know if it's a center location, then we just divide it into two parts based on the TRR distribution by the hour. So we know that at certain hours, more passengers go in one direction versus another direction.
Do you know what number or percentage of people actually, of total riders, are being told to get off and tag for cubic data? And I ask this because, I mean, obviously its primary purpose is a fare collection, but we also use that data, for example, to understand the geographic distribution of boardings and things like that. And I just hadn't realized that some of that data is in fact invalid because people are actually not tagging where they boarded, and I'm wondering what the magnitude is and how concerned I should be about that for other purposes.
So if they never tagged in the beginning, and then they get off at a particular station, and they might or might not tag at that moment, we don't know. In our data, it will show up as a fresh tag. So it will show as if they entered the station for the first time there.
Yeah, but you don't know how many people, you don't know how many people that actually represents.
I don't remember. We can calculate that because suppose the policeman or woman actually check them on their MPV device, then we have the card number. And if the same card number is tagged within a certain time window, then we can calculate. We didn't calculate that, but that can be done.
And I think, are you asking too for like what percentage of CPAS users don't tag at all?
No, what percentage of pass users don't tag in the right place? What percentage don't tag and they're told to get off the train, tag the location where they didn't actually board, and then...
Okay.
But the pass users will not be asked to get off. They're carrying a valid fare. It's only the stored value cards Those are the users who will be asked to get off and tag.
And that's where just a point, too, that we know is like 30% of CPAS users, they won't tag at all when they get on the rail system because they have a valid fare. And being human, you don't want to walk that 5 feet to tag it or whatever the issue is. And it kind of varies on the different passes. Metro Pass it's interesting. We don't know exactly the reason, but different passes have different levels of people tagging.
Do you know the percentage of total passengers that use stored value cards versus some other, like, what's your breakdown like for passes, cash, and stored value cards?
I would have to pull out the exact numbers, but yeah, roundabout, I'd say on the overall system, and bus is more cash than rail.
Even it's in the report.
Probably 30% cash, something like that. Stored value, somewhere around, I don't know, 25%. And then MetroPass is a big one. I think that's like 15, maybe. Might even be, it's a high percentage of rides. And then UPass, CPass, all those guys flow in.
Just so they can hear you?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Towards the end, you were showing.
So can I give some numbers? So on average on weekdays, there are 6,637 ticket vending machine purchases, 5,981 passes, 3,471 stored value, and 95 group purchases. Group purchases are where somebody buys multiple passenger tickets at the same time. And there is some special fare they get if they do that. And we have confidence intervals around these too.
What were those numbers again?
6,637 for ticket vending machines. These are averages, weekday averages. 5,981 for passes, 3,471 for stored value cards, and 95 for group. So there's a lot of passes. There's a lot of people buying single tickets when they enter. Yeah. But that does not mean that the people who have stored value cards are not frequent users. They tend to be frequent users of the service.
Towards the end, you were showing both that I'm going to get the word wrong, not the compliance rate, but the evasion rate was significantly higher on weekends, and also that the level of enforcement is lower on weekends. Do you see a causal connection there, or is you recommending? Is the evasion rate higher because enforcement is lower, or is it simply because of the demographics of riders or something else?
I don't think we can make any such claim. We can only show the correlation. We don't have any causal type claims. So we don't know.
You opened your slides with a photograph showing the open access, the lack of turnstiles. Is the evasion rate that you've calculated getting to the point high enough that you would consider recommending reinstituting or instituting physical barriers to when you compare benchmark against other cities with more closed access?
That's a very good question. Actually, we didn't go that route. We didn't try to figure out what's the cost to Metro Transit in terms of potentially lost fare, because that wasn't our mission. This was a very tight and compact 12-month study, so we didn't look at that question. But it's, I think, a very interesting follow-up question that if evasion rates are starting to increase, let's say at 1%, so 1%, we are talking about 70,000 rides. right? So at $2 a ride, that's $140,000 a year. Is that on an amortized basis enough to cover the cost of turnstiles? Perhaps it is, because this is year after year.
Did you look at in your just your literature search or whatever the practices in other cities that have rail systems comparable to the Twin Cities, and how does this compare to the way they calculate or their evasion and compliance, and perhaps how does it compare in terms of overall the percentages of evasions?
We did look at the literature. In the literature, there is no description of methodology. So we didn't find anybody telling us how they do it. We found statements which were sentimental statements that it's working well or it's not working well, or we have a low evasion rate or we don't have a high evasion rate, etc. But that was it. At that time, maybe now in the last 3 years there have been other studies. So in fact, this was pointed out as one of the open, interesting problems in one of the FTA meetings, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, if I could offer some input on that too. I was chairman of the Regional Fair Committee at the time we were activating the cubic system and getting ready for the Hiawatha light rail. And we did check industry data and evidence from other areas, and we found two findings that led us to support and recommend the open access system. One is that evasion in Twin Cities was one of the lowest in the country on the bus system already. We've got very honest people here, it appears at least. And secondly, the cost of maintaining a turnstile system or a barrier system versus the cost of lost revenue was a negative factor, that we would spend more trying to control the access than what we would lose by having open access.
We have a question from an online watcher. I'm just going to read out. Were expired bus-issued transfers part of the predicted noncompliance or fare evasion categories? If so, was there an estimate? Expired bus-issued transfers would be comparable to a tag that was older than 2.5 hours.
That's a good question. So it is not part of the cardholder evasion rate estimate in the second bullet here. It could be part of the first bullet, but it is not. We don't have knowledge of when a citation is given or a warning is given. It would say that they did not have a valid fare. What we don't know is whether it was because of a bus transfer from a bus that's older than 2.5 hours or not. But that is something that, if it potentially could be tracked, would be a nice statistic to have. We don't have that from the data.
Any other questions? Yep. There we go.
And maybe you can't give away any secrets about geographic locations of high non-compliance, but I'm curious in particular about the downtown travel, and you have a very short segment that could have a lot of people hopping on at Downtown East and hopping off at Nicollet or the Entertainment District, and it would seem to me that would be a very tough market to enforce. Is that addressed at all in your report, or did you find any issues with that?
I think we actually do have estimates by the station and by the hour, but it's not in the report, I just realized. It probably is in one of the task reports, not in the final report, right? Oh, it is. So this is table 3.6. So I think the stations that are different are Government Plaza, Metrodome, and Fort Snelling, right?
For the stations, there are three positive is Government Plaza,
Metrodome, and Fortunate. So these are higher non-compliance.
Yes.
Yeah. So we did compare. So the higher non-compliance tend to be Government Plaza, Metrodome, and Fort Snelling.
So this is a question, just curious about your use of the data and collection of data. If I'm a writer and I get on at Target Field after a Twins game, is that a validated ticket then? Because the officer looks at the ticket and says it's a valid ticket. Is that part of your?
Those
data,
are the
or is that
special events data.
event?
So it was a separate data calculation.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question is in regard to your previous answer. When you give a station, I mean, obviously the police are checking while the train is moving between stations. So when you say there's non-compliance at Fort Snelling, what exactly do you mean by that? Like between Fort Snelling and the airport, between Fort Snelling and the next one, or, I mean, I don't understand how you tag it to a station when typically they're continuously checking in between stations.
Right. You are right about that, and I will have to ask Ibn to explain that. This bothered us a lot. We did struggle
I remember
with this.
in the MPV device, they have a tag that record which close station they have. When the police tag that tickets, they have a record with around which station, I think.
So what he said was in the MPV data, there is a data field that tells which station is the closest station.
Okay, so it's like if you're exactly halfway between two, it might be a bit random, but if you're closer to one than the other,
Yeah, the probability that you will catch somebody at exactly half is close to zero.
I think it's set by the policeman.
But it's where they were checked, not where they got on. You have no idea where they got on.
True. We don't know where they got on unless we don't know where they got on. We know the time of where they got on, but we do know the station they got on too, right? In the MPV data, we'll know the station they got on. If they didn't tag, we don't know, of course. Yeah, but if they tagged it, we know the station.
And all the people who were, all of the evasion, the people who didn't tag, apparently.
That is correct. That's right. We don't know where they got on.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? Nope.
What is your opinion if we had a way to validate the passes on the trains instead of having have an extra validation station on each train for that passenger that is running to catch a train and can't validate it because there's a line in front or a queue in front of the validation station about 150 feet away from the train? I'm just curious because that's been an irritant of mine.
Well, so first of all, the premise is that the minute you get onto the platform, you should have a proof of purchase of fare. Otherwise, you should not be on the platform, let alone the train. So all platforms are paid fare areas or zones. Paid fare zones. Now, yes, you could think about allowing people to tag in the train, but then you also run the possibility that nobody will tag. They'll just get on the train, and the minute they see the policeman, there's a beeline to wherever the spot is where you tag, and you say, "Well, I forgot to tag, but I'm going now." So I think that's a slippery slope. There may be some people who would do this because of reasons that they could not do it before they get onto the train, but I think there's also the risk that many more people will simply not tag anymore. They can always do it at the last minute.
many European train systems and transit systems use tagging on the buses, or actually light rail systems. Italy, for example, and that was just a trip last week or a couple weeks ago. So yes, the system could work, and it would give another validation. I don't think the public know that being on the platform is a fare zone. I think that may need to be cleared up or explained to people, and as they go to as they enter the LRT.
Perhaps this might still work. I think it'll have to be tested out to see what are the pros and cons of doing this. So what's the experience in Italy? How many people actually use it on the train versus
Okay, I think unless there's any last minute questions anyone had? Great. Well, thank you so much to Professor Gupta and Richard Moore for coming.